Hello out there again, maybe. Feel free to skip this intro if you've been here before and you know what these videos are going to be about. So I highly doubt that there'll be much interest, if any, in these videos, but it was a useful project from my point of view. When I was looking at upgrading my old perpetual version of Lightroom 5.7, which was released way back in 2014. And before going down the Adobe subscription route, because I was very anti-subscription for a long time, hence why I've stuck with Lightroom 5.7 for such a long time, I wanted to just check to see whether there was any other software options out there that would give me the same functionality as Lightroom moving forward. So I explored quite a lot of software, and I'll just scroll through the list again now, just trying to find that software that I might have overlooked in the past, just to see how well they compared to Lightroom. And for this project, I was mainly just interested in seeing what starting positions each of the software that I tried offered up, because obviously in all packages you can edit images to your heart's content to get it to a point that you're happy with to achieve your vision. But for a quick workflow, it would be great if the software rendered your image in a way that was pleasing, so you didn't then have to spend minutes or hours editing the image to get it to where you wanted it to go. The reason why I was considering Adobe in the first place is I wanted to speed up and simplify my workflow, because obviously my old version of Lightroom was no longer compatible with some of the newer cameras I had, certainly not the Fujifilm X-E1. So as I mentioned in this video, which is the precursor to this series of videos, I eventually ended up going with an Adobe subscription, but I didn't really want my thoughts on the software that I trialed to go to waste, hence why I came up with the idea of this series of videos, because hopefully there might be some people out there, hopefully, that are in a similar position to me and want to explore other software options before subscribing to Adobe or Capture One or whatever, just to see what I thought of them, and especially if you haven't got the time or the patience to do a similar exercise in terms of comparing all of these programs. So yeah, I'll briefly talk about my thoughts of the actual programs when I trialed them, in terms of whether I actually liked the software, what I liked, what I didn't like about the software, how it compared to Lightroom, for instance, and the occasional rant about certain software, as well as hopefully some interesting tidbits in there somewhere, maybe. Yeah, so then I'll jump into the comparisons and I'll compare the images, the straight images, so literally just taking into the software, apply the appropriate starting profile or preset, and then export them out, put them into Lightroom so I can compare them easily with Lightroom's own efforts and with the software that I liked the best in terms of rendering each scene from each camera. And finally, I will add my thoughts on using Adobe Lightroom Classic, because I've been running this project now for nearly a year. So I've been using Adobe Lightroom for about 9 months now. So I will certainly offer up my thoughts on my experiences thus far. So let's get started for the first time, or get on with the comparisons if you've been here before. So what about just relying on the straight out camera image? Not strictly a software package, I know, but a lot of people out there, I'm sure, don't even bother with the RAW file. They just keep the JPEG, and they probably don't even select RAW plus JPEG in the camera, because obviously it takes a bit of time to get the best out of a RAW image. So let's just get rid of the RAW image and just keep the straight out camera images. In my opinion, and obviously this is very subjective based on your thoughts on this, but for me, I don't really just rely on straight out camera JPEGs these days. Virtually all my cameras I just shoot RAW only, just because I know that even though the straight out camera image might look okay, I know that I can push the RAW file and produce something better. The exception to the rule is probably the Fuji X-E1 images. I find them very usable in my opinion, and I'm really only talking about the Pavia film simulation straight out of camera JPEG from the X-E1. I find the other profiles to be not great, and even though a lot of people do like the monochrome profiles, I again tend to get better results when I convert them using software such as Silver FX Pro, which I haven't covered in this project because I see that software as more of a plugin to use with your base program. So whatever base program you use, whether that's Photolab, Capture One, Lightroom, you can all utilize a plugin such as Silver FX Pro to convert your images to a monochrome image beyond the base program's monochrome edits and options. But going back to the straight out of camera JPEG, so with the Fuji X-E1, there's even sometimes where I've just kept that and ditched the RAW file, because even when I threw the RAW file with the X-E1 image through Lightroom or Iridiant, I still tended to find that the original JPEG had just something more about it. That's not always the case. It's probably one of the only cameras that I still have the option of RAW plus JPEG selected, because sometimes the JPEG from that camera is enough. So I got the Fujifilm X RAW Studio screen up now because in some instances when I was using the Fuji X-H1, I did tweak the output sometimes using this piece of software, which in essence is a form of in-camera processing, as you need the camera plugged into your computer for the software to work, but on the whole it's quite slow and clunky to use, and I could only use it with my X-H1. The X-E1 is not compatible, and with the X-H1 it's limited to JPEG exports only. On the whole, I find that adjustments, whether I'm doing them in camera or in the Fujifilm X RAW Studio, I just find that the adjustments you can make to be too severe in altering an image to be of much practical use. There's no like in between. You either have to go for like +1 shadows, +1 highlights, or -1 highlights. There's no more fidelity than that. And I did try and design my own film sim recipes, certainly for the X-H1, because I was trying to find a simulation that I would use all the time moving forward. But the problem I find with film sims and any kind of profiles and presets that people are trying to sell to you is that they don't always work with multiple images. That's why I still tend to develop all my images on an individual basis. Unless you're shooting like a wedding or you shoot a lot of images in quick succession, the same profile preset that you can apply is not necessarily going to work on all the images that you have, because there's going to be different lighting, different subjects, which all need to be edited at face value and edited on the strengths and weaknesses of that particular scenario. So yeah, so I did try and design my own film sim, but I just experienced the same issues in the fact that you can't have much fidelity in the settings that you have access to, which are identical to the ones that you have access to in camera. So as such, the results were very inconsistent, and what I said before, what works with one image doesn't necessarily work with others in my experience. So let's just have a quick look at some of these out of camera JPEGs, which I think are probably limited to the Fuji cameras. And I was right, they're just on the Fuji cameras, because I'm not a massive fan of Olympus straight out of camera JPEGs, nor my Canon straight out of camera JPEGs either. And I've since tried my Olympus EM1 Mark II and my Sony A7S and the Nikon D200. And in all those cases, I much prefer taking the RAW file and editing that to how I see it going. So taking a look at the images for one last time. So this is Lightroom's rendering of this scene. It's Pavia film simulation. This is Iridiant, and this is the straight out of camera JPEG. So it's not quite as good in this case as Irradiance, but it's somewhere in between, I would say, the three. It's got a little bit of the highlight retention of Irradiance efforts, but it's got a little bit of the brightness associated with Lightroom. But I think in this case, I still prefer Irradiance take on the scene. So let's take another look at a Fuji X-E1 image. So this is the RAW file in Lightroom. This is the JPEG, so very, very close actually to what Lightroom produced. And then this is Irradiant. So again, very, very similar. So I'll just do a quick pixel peep in here just for my benefit. Yeah, so you can tell here, or I can tell, that as much as I do like the straight arrow camera JPEG, the Irradiant version has a lot more detail, and then of course because it's a RAW file using the DNG format, I know that in post I'll be able to push that a lot harder if I wish. And you can just see here actually it's got a lot more detail in the image to that of the JPEG. So whilst the JPEG looks good and probably will be acceptable to most people, in this instance I would choose the Irradiant to continue working with. Right, so let's have a look at the final image for the Fuji X-H1. So that's the Lightroom's version. This is the straight arrow camera JPEG. So again, Lightroom has done a pretty good job, and I'll just do a quick comparison here just to see the level of detail between the two versions. It's pretty good actually, because I actually think the JPEG does have more detail, but of course you could just easily rectify that in Lightroom. So not much difference between the arrow camera JPEG and the Lightroom version. And then let's have a quick look at the winning software for this image, which was Photolab 6. So if I just do a quick comparison. Yeah, I just find, yeah, there's just a lot more detail in Photolab's version and a lot more separation in the tonality of the image, whereas that looks a bit muddy, whereas this is nice and clear. You can easily see the different colours of that particular route on the wall. So yeah, so definitely Photolab 6 did a really good job there. So yeah, out of those Fuji X-E1 files, yes, the JPEG was nice looking, but if I was approaching this from the first time having seen these images, I would opt for the RAW versions, whether that's in Irradiant or Photolab 6. But because I don't have Photolab 6, I would be perfectly fine with taking Lightroom's rendering in this instance. So let's have a look at X-H1. We're nearing the end now. So this is the X-H1's. So this is Lightroom's take using the Previa film simulation, and this is the outer camera JPEG. So this is pretty much what I found for all Fuji X-H1 files, in that Lightroom does a great job at nailing what it looks like from a JPEG perspective, with obviously the benefits of being a RAW, so you can then push it as far as you need to take it. What I've done here, this is the image that I've processed in Fuji X RAW Studio. So in this particular one, I've reduced the highlights and the shadows by 1. So if we compare that to the original JPEG, you'll see that has managed to bring out a bit more of the detail in the sky, and then also lifted the shadows a little bit more. The detail will be probably the same, but it's a tough one, because you do, I think this is what I said, and is why I don't use it, is because those subtle changes, you've almost lost a little bit of the punch and the contrast that the straight arrow camera image provides, and that's probably why in this instance, I'd probably pick the Lightroom image, because you can then take that further but you can take that as far as you want, but then retaining the look of the original straight out of camera JPEG. And you can instantly see here that the Lightroom version does a great job. There's a real sheen in this image on a particular car, whereas in comparison the JPEG is a little bit on the flat side. So yeah, if I still had my Fuji X-E1, I'd be more than happy with the Lightroom's effort in this scenario. To the final image, and Lightroom doesn't do a great job with this particular image. I just find that the greens, the tonality of them, they're all too similar on the spectrum, whereas if you look at my favoured software for this particular scene, which is Luminar, you'll see that it does have a much more natural tonality right across the frame, and it manages to have, you can more easily see the different shades within the same, you can easily see different shades of green rather than just maybe one green that you can see in Lightroom's version. And then if we just have a quick look at the JPEG, that is obviously the same, like I said, as the Lightroom's rendering of the RAW file. So that's why when I had my Fuji X-E1, I never shot with JPEGs. I always shot with RAW only, whereas on the Fuji X-E1, sometimes the JPEG was good enough. Right, so that's the end of this part. I hope some of it is at least interesting or useful to you. Thanks for sticking with it to the end. See you next week for more of the same until this series is done. Bye for now.